Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. And thank you to our distinguished speakers who are generously sharing their time. My name is Alana McFarlane, and I will be your co-host. I also want to start us off in a good way and acknowledge the historic and current relationship that exists between the unceded land in which I live and work and the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I also encourage everyone on this webinar to consider the lands on which they are located and the Indigenous peoples who have been stewards and protectors of the land since time immemorial. I'm the newest member of the Citizen Advisory Committee for Metro Vancouver West Community Corrections, a division of Correctional Service Canada, and as a person dedicated to advancing collaborative dialogue as a means of moving towards greater understanding that is so needed in today's complex world. I really feel privileged to be a part of this committee's work. So I'm just going to start us off with a few notes. This webinar is scheduled to run for 2 hours, and that's to 12 noon Pacific time. There are no breaks, so please take the time that you need to stretch or get a glass of water. If you're experiencing any audio or video difficulties, you might try using a personal device rather than your work device. That sometimes helps troubleshoot. Closed captioning is available in several languages, and it can be turned on in your settings. It's not perfect, but many find that it does a reasonable job. A recording of this event will be made available later, along with the slides and any other materials. And please note that your video will not be on, but you are welcome to participate by submitting questions to the panelists in the chat. We ask everyone, please be respectful when posing questions. We know that you will. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. If we can't answer all of them, our panelists will try to provide responses later. And now I would like to introduce Dennis Herfst, Area Director for Metro Vancouver West Community Corrections at Correctional Service Canada. Over to you, Dennis.
Thanks, Alana. Thank you for the introduction, and welcome everyone. It's great to be here. Depending on where you're joining us from today, I'll say either good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. We're very excited for this webinar today and for our distinguished list of panelists whom will be introduced shortly. My name is Dennis Herfst. I'm the Area Director overseeing the Vancouver Parole District for the Correctional Service of Canada. Here in Vancouver, we supervise approximately 250 offenders on parole that have been released from our federal penitentiaries. Our mission and mandate in the Correctional Service of Canada is twofold. One is to ensure and enhance public safety, and number two is to assist the offenders entrusted to our care in their reintegration efforts to become law-abiding citizens. In working towards this mandate, we work closely with many partners and stakeholders, both internal and external to our organization. And one of the key partners that we work closely with is our Citizen Advisory Committees, or CACs for short. Our CACs, the existence of those is enshrined in our legislation, and they're basically small groups of volunteers that are attached to every penitentiary and parole area in the country. And their primary purpose is to observe, liaise, and advise. That's kind of their threefold purpose: to observe, liaise, and advise on the correctional operations, policy, and procedures of the Correctional Service of Canada. Here in Vancouver, we're very fortunate to have a very dedicated and active Citizen Advisory Committee, for which I'm very thankful. Our CAC here started a webinar during the pandemic, almost 5 years ago now. And it's now become an annual event. So today is now our 5th annual webinar. Our previous 4 webinars have been on the topics of aging offenders, the needs of victims, community support programs for high-risk offenders and their families, and last year was about digital literacy in corrections. So each year we strive to bring forward topics that are of relevance to people inside and outside of the justice system. All of our webinars attract a wide audience, including corrections professionals, police officers, nonprofits, healthcare practitioners, researchers, policymakers, students, and people with lived experience. And today, We have close to 700 people registered, which is a record for us. So we're quite excited about that. I know not everybody can join us live, obviously. People from around the world have registered, so some of these people will be joining later to watch record versions, but we're very excited about everybody joining today. We have people representing 8 provinces in Canada, 23 US states, as well as the UK, France, Portugal, Australia, New Zealand, China, and Pakistan, amongst others. So a diverse group of participants out there that have joined us. So I encourage everyone to make use of the chat as well. Introduce yourself, say hello. Feel free to connect with people that are part of this webinar. So with that in mind, I will turn things over to Eddy Elmer. Eddy is the vice chair of our local Citizen Advisory Committee here in Vancouver, British Columbia. He's also the regional chair for our Pacific region and the vice chair of our National Executive Committee of Citizen Advisory Committees in Canada. So Eddy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you very much for your support in working with us on these webinars. And thank you everyone for joining us today. So my name is Eddy. I'm a researcher and PhD student in sociology and social gerontology, and I focus on aging and mental health in marginalized groups, and I focus particularly on loneliness and social isolation. And my interest in corrections was piqued during my gerontology studies when I learned about the aging of our prison population. And so that got me to joining the CAC in 2019, and I've been with the CAC since then and have learned and taken an interest in a lot of different topics related to corrections, including the one that we'll be discussing today, which is traumatic brain injury, or TBI. So TBI is common among individuals in custody or on release in the community and can significantly impact their emotions, their behavior, their decision-making, cognitive functioning, and rehabilitation outcomes. So today's webinar will focus on the impact of TBI on these individuals and discuss strategies to improve assessment, support, and rehabilitation with the ultimate aim of reducing reoffending and enhancing public safety. So we have 5 excellent speakers today who will discuss various aspects of this very big topic. We have first Dr. Hugh Williams, who's a professor of clinical neuropsychology and co-director of the Center for Clinical Neuropsychology Research at Exeter University in the UK. We have Dr. Kim Gorgens, who is a professor of psychophysiology, clinical neuropsychology, and the psychology of criminal behavior in the Graduate School of Psychology at the University of Denver. We have Dr. Flora Matheson, who is the Unity Health Toronto Chair in Homelessness, Housing and Health. We have Dr. Annmarie Burns, who is a consultant clinical neuropsychologist at Brainkind UK and the North London Mental Health Partnership NHS Trust. And she will be joined by Elizabeth Wiltz, who is the project manager of the Brain Injury Linkworker service at Brainkind. So Alana, I turn the floor to you to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Hugh Williams.
Thanks so much, Eddy. I'd like to welcome Dr. Hugh Williams. Dr. Williams is a professor of clinical neuropsychology and co-director of the Center for Clinical Neuropsychology Research at Exeter University in the UK. He is also the Associate Pro-Vice Chancellor for Global Engagement for the Faculty of Health and Life Sciences. His research focuses on the links between TBI and criminal offending, the economic costs of crime due to TBI, and neurotrauma in women, children, and young adults in custody. He also studies TBI screening and support in prisons and the use of Linkworker services to manage TBI in the community. Dr. Williams' other work examines sports concussions and stress and injury among police officers. Dr. Williams provides expert consultation to correctional services and organizations throughout the UK and other jurisdictions via work with UNESCO and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Dr. Williams, thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much. And that's, well, it's wonderful to hear from where you're all from, as you might say, and to be invited to give a talk to you. Can I just check that you can hear me okay at the moment? Perfect, thank you. And I'm actually in the southwest of England, which once upon a time was part of Greater Wales, I imagine. And anyway, The talk that I'm going to give is about traumatic brain injury and criminal justice involvement, to give a flavour for some of the ways in which people with brain injury can end up in our criminal justice systems. And it may make you start to think about how can we intervene earlier, better, to try to reduce the chances of the criminalisation of people. I think you indicated that many people may end up in the criminal justice system having had a brain injury. It's actually more likely than not that if you're in the criminal justice system, you have a brain injury. So as I keep mentioning to our governors and ministers of health and prisons and so on, prisons are brain injury units without adequate resources. And what we need to do is try to reorientate services to both try to reduce the chances of children and young people whose systems of support in life are negligible. That means that when they're more likely to have a brain injury, more likely to enter into the criminal justice system, and more likely to be a cost to the state, but also a cost to others. So if you're thinking about prevention, this is a critical issue in prevention of crime. So I also have in my talk a sense that violence to others is a critical factor in brain trauma, but it's also a factor in violence to self, suicide. Just moving on, if the cursor allows me. So I'm a neuropsychologist and not a forensic psychologist. And when I started working in this area, when I shifted from working in rehabilitation services to people with brain injury, and it was an accident of that I ended up working in prisons because I had a student who was a prison officer. I wanted to do a study on how often people in prison have post-traumatic stress disorder. And I thought, well, critically, we need to know how many have a head injury. And if you imagine that one person in 10 in general society have a brain injury of some sort, mostly mild, 9 or 10 people in 100 have mild brain injuries, 2 people in 100 have moderate severe brain injuries, then, we may want to find out how many people in our prison system have a brain injury. That was about 15 years ago or more by now. But in any case, I started to look into what are some of the characteristics of people who end up in our prison systems. And they are things like impulse control problems, problems in thinking ahead, problems about changing behavior. And that's interesting. And it's interesting that so many people enter into the criminal justice system from a relatively young age. It's a crime spike between 15 and 23. So it tends to be something to do with young people. And it also tends to be a male issue. About 8 in 10 people incarcerated are male. In the UK, we have about 85,000 people in prison who are male and 3,400 or so who are female. So one big issue is brain maturity. In this slide, I just want you to take away the message that brains are not static state. Brains are biochemical electrical systems that connect to them, which is amazingly complex. 100 billion neurons with connectivity that's awesome, up to 30,000 connections per neuron. And these brain systems evolve into being over time. And the critical thing to notice in the top left there, the stages as which the brain is going through a particularly strong burst of development. And so the early years, of course, 7 to 9 years, of course, 13, 15, 17, 19, still brain development happening. And that brain development particularly vital in the adolescence period to do with emotion control. The adolescent brain at 13, 14 is mature in areas to do with the sense of urge, love and lust and all the rest of it are pretty mature. But the control systems aren't mature yet. The control system from the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex are not mature. So decision making is rather obscured by very strong emotions. So we always need to think about the ways in which a brain is sculpted into being. And if an injury happened at a time of childhood and adolescence, not only is it at a time of risk-taking behavior, possibly, but also The brain is having its pathways laid down at this point. So the fatty tissue, the myelin sheath that protects the connections between your neurons, is just being laid at this point. So injuries in child adolescents actually are more problematic for long-term cognitive functions than hitherto we had thought. So we need to bear that in mind. People don't grow out of their injuries, unfortunately. So what does that mean? Well, the brain injuries and the long-term outcomes is something I wanted to discuss, but put into a bit of context. The context of brain injury is really important. Who are the people who are likely to brain injuries? Now, a bit like the spike in crime, risk-taking behaviors in adolescents, particularly boys, is associated with having head injuries. That can spike in head injuries between 40 and 21, particularly male, and so on. But if you track back in this graphic, you'll find that the under fives at age 2, 3, 4 are also at huge risk of brain injury, particularly from socially deprived backgrounds. We showed in a study that the poorest 5%, the kids from the poorest 5% of society, when they're under 5 years of age, are 5 times more likely to have a brain injury. That's consequential because this is even before you started school, and you are probably going to be the kids without sufficient supervision because your parents may have difficulty in being able to provide you with that support at that stage because you're in a precarious environment. So we need to think about these kinds of injuries from a young age. Now, another big factor around brain injury. Okay, brain injury is typically associated with road accidents and falls and so on, but also violence is a big cause of traumatic brain injury. Studies in Europe, in China, shows violence is a big issue. About 12% of brain injuries in China are, 13% are from violence, and about 7% in Europe. Now, really importantly, over the last few years, there's been better awareness of how often brain injury is due to intimate partner violence, particularly when it comes to women. When intimate personal violence is looked at, there's a massive disparity between people who suffer a traumatic brain injury in an intimate partner context, female versus male, 75% versus 5%. Now, the consequences of these injuries in women are much greater for women, 27% with more severe brain injuries compared to 5% in men, and a much greater level of mortality. Now, I want to flag this because it's a big issue in societies that has hitherto been under the surface and not really been properly addressed. Around the world, brain injury is a big issue, 5 times more likely in the global south, and it's the biggest cause of death and disability in anybody up to the age 40. So it's a big issue, and how to address this is very important. In the Canadian context, I'm not obviously Canadian, but I'm very interested and fascinated around the problems of First Nations and or Indigenous populations, where because of the precariousness of the environments caused by others, there is an increased likelihood of brain trauma to happen, but also on top of that, an increased likelihood there will be a lack of supportive systems around people to ensure that there is sufficient scaffolding of support. Just want to flag that. So traumatic brain injury is really prevalent, as I've just mentioned, and problematic. Mild and moderate severe brain injury happens when there's an impact of the brain when it moves around inside the skull, and a fast stop type injury in a car accident or an assault. And the areas of the brain typically affected are the frontal regions and the temporal regions, vital for decision making, planning ahead, thinking it through, and impulse control. And also vital for social communication. The brain system's involved in deciding, should I approach or avoid this person? Is this person angry with me or wants to have a chat with me? That system is often affected in children and young people with a brain injury, so they're not very good on social communication. We've shown in various studies that children with brain injuries are more likely to have problems in understanding the emotions of others and reading their minds and deciding what to do in various situations. So I'm going to jump through this a little bit, but just to give you that flavor of the literature, which is that the majority of kids and young people after brain injury will have problems with memory, social cognition, depression, and disinhibition. But even after mild brain injury, because it's more consequential in young people, about 30% have problems like oppositional defiant disorder or ADHD, are they oppositional defiant, or they just don't understand what they're being asked to do, or won't remember what they're being told to do? So it's really interesting. We need to understand better impulsivity, poor social skills, and externalizing behaviors as due to underlying brain injury that has not been diagnosed. In an interesting study in the States, there were studies showing that it was more likely in kids with brain injury that they would end up being medicated, being suicidal, being bullied, and being victimized. And that's interesting because it ties, sadly, really well with other studies in New Zealand, showing that in a birth cohort study, that kids who, when they have a brain injury before age of 5, by the time they're 7 or 8, they're twice as likely to have problems in school. By the time they're 11 or 12, they're twice as likely to experience school failure or being excluded from school for not being able to concentrate and acting out, apparently. And by the time they're 14, they're twice as likely to be in contact with the law for fire setting, property damage, and interpersonal violence. So the problems are there. A really good study in Sweden, my colleague Sina Fassel, showing in a total population study of all Swedes, that a brain injury triples your risk of violent crime, and it doubles the risk of violent crime in those who already have the pre-existing issues that would typically be associated with crime. A recent Danish study along the same lines indicating increased chances of violence post-brain injury, but also importantly, increased chances of suicidality. So it's a big issue for suicide prevention and violence prevention. When we did a study in a prison 15, 20 years ago, we showed that 60% or more of prisoners had a brain trauma, and the average age of first imprisonment was 16 compared to 21 when there was a brain injury. This is consistent with neuroimaging studies in Germany showing that often people in prison for violence offences are in there, but they have lesions in the frontal lobes of their brains more often than lesions in other parts of the brain. Then people who are in for non-violent crimes have more lesions than the general population, but not in the frontal lobes. There's something about frontal lobe injuries involving dysexecutive disorders that's associated with crime. When we looked at young people in prisons, we find a very high rate of brain trauma, 60% plus, and that's associated with greater levels of violence. We've also found that in these populations, there's greater likelihood that their parenting was typically neglectful in style. So they're more likely to have had head injuries because nobody's looking out for them. They have the head injuries, then they perform poorly at school, they're kicked out of school, and they're then often picked up by criminal entities, gangs, and all the rest of it, and then exploited, particularly, unfortunately, importantly, in girls between 10 and 13 who fall off the radar very often. We also shown that brain injury is associated with greater likelihood of not only school exclusion, but that school exclusion being associated with entry to prison a few years later, the school to prison pipeline as is described. So in general, brain injury alongside other neurodisabilities is common in young people who end up in our prisons, and this then becomes a prison population. In women in prison, more than 60% have had a brain injury, and the biggest cause of their injuries are intimate partner violence. We've done studies in prison populations in Scotland, women, and find that half have ongoing problems due to neurodisability, and a quarter very significant problems due to neurodisability, often due to brain injury, and they can't pay attention to what they're being asked to do. They're not very good at following instructions, and therefore they have poor life skills, and therefore they need support to change behaviour. A colleague of mine, Tom McMillan, showed similar trends in Scottish prison studies that he did, and found that there was a co-occurrence of post-traumatic stress disorder and domestic abuse, intimate partner violence in the population. Working with Brainkind, previously known as Disability Trust, we put link workers into prisons in young offender prisons, i.e. juvenile delinquent kind of prisons in the UK, as well as into women's prisons. And it was very promising, and you'll hear more about this, findings about how we can change the rehabilitation of people who offend so they are less likely to offend. We also worked with police systems, Devon Corn Police in the UK and South Wales Police and other police forces to improve their surveillance and adoption of more appropriate management. So they try to support people in the community by picking up on a brain injury, Therefore, someone needs to be reminded or making sure they get to that housing association appointment or the drug treatment program and so on, because they won't remember because they've had a head injury. They need a reminder to do that, and that's worked relatively well. So we're working with a number of police forces around screening in custody, particularly to do with young people and women. So brain trauma is highly associated with poorer engagement in treatment. Of course it is, because it's harder for them to engage in treatment, because it was hard for them to engage in schooling and all the rest of it. It's associated with infractions, reconvictions. So to change conviction profiles, to reduce violence, we need to pay attention to brain trauma and also pay attention to the PTSD, especially in women who end up in prison. Just also factor in the suicidality of this population. It can be screened for, and there's a low cost, high gain interventions. We've done some economic analysis we'll come back to if we have time, showing the benefits of screening. I'm pleased that there's people from New Zealand here, because in New Zealand, young people are now being screened effectively for neurodisability before they get judged. And there's much more use of restorative justice in the community. We need to move to a deflection and diversion so that we can improve the chances that people will be able to change behavior in ways that are non-punitive and less likely to make their problems worse by entering the criminal justice system. The United Nations recently changed the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and adopted the notion that we had been advocating for, to ensure that societies, nation states need to do more, not only to address the issues in kids and young people in justice systems around the world, but to lessen the chances that vulnerable people who have neurodisability, whose behaviors don't help them fit into society, are not then punished on top of that and end up in our criminal justice systems. So there is a legal system from the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child to need to be enacted to ensure there's better outcomes for people with a neurodisability worldwide. If you're particularly interested in anything I've been talking about, there's a fair few reports that we've conducted, and there's one coming through soon on a whole system approach based on UN conventions to try to improve policing, social care, and health and education integration to improve outcomes for young people with a brain trauma. And I'll end there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Hugh. That was very informative, and a lot of information I found very useful. Okay, so we will turn now to our second speaker. I'd like to introduce Dr. Kim Gorgens, who is a professor of psychophysiology, clinical neuropsychology, and psychology of criminal behavior at the Graduate School of Professional Psychology at the University of Denver. Her research explores the TBI history, cognitive function, and brain injury biomarkers of athletes, men and women in the criminal legal system, as well as unhoused people and women exposed to interpersonal violence. She has given TED Talks about TBI and lectured around the world, and her research has been featured on CNN, NPR, 2020, Newsweek, The Economist, and many other outlets. She also has a forensic neuropsychology practice where she works on high-stakes juvenile homicide and death penalty cases. Dr. Gorgens was also instrumental in the Colorado Senate bills requiring brain injury screening for incarcerated individuals and for victims of violent crime. So Dr. Gorgens, the floor is yours.
Eddy, thanks so much. Let me share my screen. How impossible is it to follow Hugh? That is pretty tough. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, Eddy, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And this is a little bit like a masterclass, the chance for me to hear from Hugh and Flora and the whole of the panel and the audience. Super quick hello to all my friends in Kelowna. Also, this is really such an honor to get this invitation, and thanks so much for having me. And if I can be helpful, this is how you reach me. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit from Hugh's presentation and talk a little bit about the very common behavioral health sequela of injury
And then I'm going to talk about some of our criminal justice research and we call it the Colorado brain injury model, but models to support people while they're in jails and in the correctional system, and then ultimately to help them navigate their way back out into the community. But if it's helpful, I thought I might start with the big picture, which is the very common sequela of injury. This is not unique to only people who are involved in the criminal legal system. This is true for everybody. Brain injuries are inflammatory injuries. If you have a moderate to severe injury, you may also have structural damage in the brain. Otherwise, all of mild injuries are metabolic injuries, and these injuries all create inflammation. The reason I feel so strongly about talking about inflammation is that so many of the consequences of brain injury are related to that inflammation and highly stigmatized. And the way we think about them as a consequence of the physiology of the injury itself, I think goes a long way towards destigmatizing the experience of depression or hopelessness after injury. So thanks for indulging me on that soapbox very briefly. Most people at the time of a brain injury will be physically symptomatic. That means they'll have some kind of sign or clinical symptom that oftentimes includes a headache, includes dizziness. Interestingly, for headaches, the rate of post-traumatic headache is higher for people who have a mild brain injury relative to people with more significant injuries. But very commonly, people experience those symptoms for as many as 6 to 12 months after injury. There are also a whole host of cognitive complaints after injury, changes in working memory or mental flexibility, changes in processing speed, which is kind of the horsepower that your brain operates at. Those are very common, also can take months to resolve. And then there are these really interesting behavioral health consequences, so psychological and substance use related. On the psychology side, there's a really interesting statistic that I hope will stick in the minds of a lot of people watching today, which is that almost half of people who sustain a brain injury will develop a clinically significant presentation in that first year after injury. These are folks with no pre-injury history of psychological distress or suffering. So oftentimes those folks are poorly prepared for that kind of sequela. It's not a conversation they're having with anyone. They're well past the period of time where they're being supervised by a medical professional. The risk for suicide is extraordinarily high. This is the underlined bold font point that I know my colleagues and I would hope that everyone leaves with. In some data sets, the risk is that suicidal ideation is 7 times higher. We've found that it's about 100% in our research, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. The risk of suicide attempts, population base rate is about 17%. In a group of people who have a brain injury history. That number is less than 1% in the general population. And my colleague, Sina Fazal, published on a longitudinal data set that was 15 years old at the time that she published those data, suggesting that the increased risk for suicidal ideation is persistent at that 15-year mark. There's nothing particularly special about 15 years other than the data set was 15 years old at the time. What that means for you in clinical practice or in day-to-day work with persons with a brain injury history is that even for someone whose brain injury was sustained years ago, you should assume that their risk for self-harm is much higher than is true for the rest of your patient populations. And people also get themselves into trouble with things like poisoning, which brings me to the other very common sequela, which is substance misuse. Substance misuse has a really interesting chicken and egg phenomena with brain injury. Perhaps intuitively, people who abuse substances are more likely to sustain brain injuries, and their risk for relapsing to substance abuse is much higher. That all perhaps makes a lot of sense, and we might have assumed that to be true. What is less intuitive, though, is that people with no pre-injury history of substance misuse are at risk for developing a new substance misuse problem, and then their risk for relapsing to substance abuse is also much higher. This is a headline from a few years ago from Newsweek magazine that makes a point that many of us in clinical practice already knew, which is the really common entanglement between people who have a history of brain injury and opiate misuse in particular. This is some work that I've been excited to support in Kelowna. This is perhaps the most vicious of cycles where people sustain acquired or anoxic brain injuries via near lethal overdose from fentanyl or other synthetic opiates, which increases their risk to relapse again to opiate use, which then increases the likelihood that they sustain another anoxic brain injury in this really devastating, deteriorating cycle that oftentimes ends in death. This is a great piece that one of my doctoral students and I were able to get out this year that paints a picture from a clinical perspective of that cycle between anoxic brain injury or the damage sustained by the brain in the period of time where someone wasn't breathing, so revived by Narcan. That creates this additional risk to relapse, which creates additional risk for the next ABI and so on and so forth. Importantly, after I've made brain injury sound like the worst thing ever, our brains are extraordinary and we have the capacity for tremendous recovery. We have neuroplasticity across a lifespan. What I love about neuroscience is I find it to be inherently optimistic. What is true, though, is not everyone recovers fully after brain injury, and the reasons have kept pace with evolving science. We used to think, well, there's something unique about just this small percentage of people who don't recover fully after injury, and now we realize that that percentage is probably much larger than we previously thought. And the people in that population percentage who don't recover fully have things in common. That includes having all manner of vulnerable brains, younger brains, just like you said, older brains, people who have other health conditions, particularly inflammatory disease. Remember, brain injury is inflammation, depression is an inflammatory disease, etc. People with a history of exposure to violence, whether that's childhood trauma, intimate partner violence, people with a history of mental illness and substance use, and people with a history of previous brain injuries, particularly injuries that they've not yet fully recovered from. That puts them at an extraordinarily high risk for poor outcomes. Hugh mentioned that in the general population, the rate of brain injury is roughly about 10%. So if you were to poll this group, we would land with about 10%. But that number is much higher in some of these safety net systems, as Hugh just reviewed for you with some of the meta-analytic data from larger studies. These are some of the numbers from research studies here in the States. These are safety net systems. So when we poll the general population, and we do a lot of research with college athletes and retired athletes, and we do a lot of community service screenings, and we work a lot in these safety net systems, like in family resource centers for women exposed to violence and in jails and prisons here in Colorado and around the country. In resource centers serving women exposed to intimate partner violence, the rate of brain injury history is about 87%. We published some research here during COVID looking at the rate of brain injury history among people who were homeless, chronically homeless, so had been homeless for at least the preceding 12 months. That number was 70%. Asterisk for anybody who's curious, we wondered chicken and egg, brain injury, and homelessness. And in 76% of the cases among people who had brain injury history, their first brain injury predated their first episode of homelessness. So in fact, it's like chicken and egg. In the criminal legal system, we've been doing this kind of work for about 12 years now. The overall rate, this many thanks to a colleague's doctoral student, the overall rate in the States is about 46%. In juvenile probation settings, we've published with some of these data, the number is slightly lower at 30%. In our youth correction sample here in Colorado and in Pennsylvania in maximum security youth detention settings, that rate is about 51%. In a pilot program here, looking at the rate of brain injury among people who are participating in a competency restoration program, the rate is 90%. And our rate in community corrections and jail settings ranges from 45 to 97%. I just want to drill into this picture, though, because brain injury is one feature of the history that these folks are struggling with. And the picture is one of behavioral health complications. On the left, on this slide, is, and apologies for the illegibility of the tiny number, but I'll review it for the group here. The red bar is among folks who are involved in the criminal legal system who have a significant history of brain injury. And the little gray bar is general population base rate. So history of substance abuse, 95% of folks with significant brain injury history in the criminal legal system have a history of substance abuse. That number is 7% in the general population. 76% have significant history of mental illness. Suicidal ideation, I mentioned, is about 100%. The rate of one or more suicide attempts is 39%. The rate of childhood trauma, remember I mentioned that exposure to trauma is one way to create a vulnerable brain. That was about 60% for childhood, about 60% also for exposure to violence as an adult. And then this constellation of early academic problems, which I'll talk more about in just a minute. Very briefly, Flora is going to offer a masterclass here on the experience of women in the criminal legal system, but I'm just highlighting, we have a paper under review right now. This is an older paper with one of my graduate students that looked at the collision of multiple brain injuries. This is 3 or more injuries sustained in a short period of time, and other vulnerabilities among women who are in the criminal legal system. What was true is that women were 6 times more likely to have multiple brain injuries, 3 or more in a short period of time, related to violence, which sets them up for all manner of poor outcomes associated uniquely with violence-related brain injuries. And we make the point that these women look a little bit like retired NFL players or retired footballers without the benefit of documentaries or liability coverage. And the experience of these women is particularly dire. Another note, just briefly about youth. This is a paper that is under review now with my colleagues in the CDC epidemiology team who work in the brain injury space. Julie Harbauer-Krupa, who many of you may already know, does amazing work in this space. We are trying to paint a picture of what Hugh alluded to, which is the injury to prison pathway, and specifically looking at the contribution of other psychosocial variables, including brain injury, to that trajectory, and importantly, how we might change that trajectory. These data were extracted from a public health database. These are parental report data. In a nutshell, kids who had a brain injury history were much more likely than their peers to experience all of these other psychosocial vulnerabilities, including behavioral health problems that we've already talked about. So that's complaints about mental illness, behavioral disturbance, substance use, also academic difficulties, and all manner of adverse childhood experiences or ACEs. So brain injury uniquely controlled more of the variance than the other variables did in that particular study. And I've made everything about brain injury suggest that it is a dire emergency. And the truth is that there's so much we can do. And there's so much, I would say, like really exciting energy in the space of changing the trajectory on the pretrial side, and then ultimately for folks who are involved in the system already, changing their trajectory out of the system and to keep them afloat in the community. That's the model that I'm going to share very briefly. And here are some data that we published to suggest that you can do just that with some really easy, cost-effective interventions. I say cost-effective, and what I mean here is like big, bold font, free. So we've managed to create this whole model with sticks and gum and like twine and masking tape. So happy to share all of the materials for free. We've built them and trialed them. We've exported it to a number of other states here in the US. We've been training on this model around the world. here are the three component parts of a model that actually changes the trajectory for people who are leaving the criminal justice system. So once we've identified them in the system, this helps them get their needs met as they move through the system, through all the requirements of navigating a conditional release and then ultimately to be off paper in the community. The first component part is screening for brain injury history. But that's not enough. It's not enough to just know that someone has a brain injury history. If you do, the clinicians in the audience, like maybe will hear this point, which is if the only thing you know about someone is that they have a brain injury history, you know something about their acuity or their risk for poor outcomes. You don't know anything else. So the second component part of our model has been to screen cognitive function and to screen psychosocial vulnerabilities so that you know how to deliver care to address those psychosocial vulnerabilities. So we talk about in our model telling the audience for our 2-page neuropsychological report, more on that in a different presentation, telling that audience member how to deliver care. It might be a report written for a judge. Here's how to engage this person in a courtroom. It might be to a probation officer. Here's how to enlist the maximum compliance from this client in probation. It's all of the things. And the third component part is education and self-advocacy. Very briefly, we use an instrument called the Ohio State University Brain Injury Identification Method, or OSU for short. John Corrigan is the author of this scale. We've modified it with his permission. He's been a longstanding member of our research team. Many of my colleagues who work in the intimate partner violence space use an instrument called the HELPS. In our IPV research here, we use the OSU and the HELPS, and we're doing really interesting head-to-head comparisons. Turns out the HELPS is probably slightly better in those settings. The OSU may set the threshold slightly higher. So we've found, particularly in criminal legal settings, that this instrument performs really well. It was normed and standardized on a criminal legal population by John Corrigan and his colleagues. It's a 2-page instrument. Really, it's like 1 page, but front and back. Here's the front of this instrument. Here's the back page. Importantly, we've modified the scoring for this instrument. We used it in a pilot study about 13 years ago and thought that the potential for false positives was slightly higher than we felt comfortable with, asterisk, recognizing that in any program development, you'd rather risk over-serving than turning someone away. That still being true, we thought maybe we were flagging some people who didn't have the kind of injury history that warranted that attention. So we've modified the scoring. I'm happy to share this document. You can find 1 million copies of the OSU that have been adapted to different settings. You can find that online. And I have found that almost everyone using a version of the OSU is happy to share the original copy of that. This can be administered in 5 minutes by anyone. Doesn't require any professional licensure or training. It's really a very brief 10-minute conversation about how to use the instrument. Our cognitive screening battery, our favorite instrument, I say our, like anybody else has a favorite neuropsychological instrument except me, maybe. My favorite computerized instrument is the ANAM, or Automated Neuropsychological Assessment Metric. That group has made their software available for free to people who are working in underserved systems. So I say that because some of you may want to get in touch and play around with that software and reach out, and I can put you in touch with the test publishers. What we found over the last 12 years was we couldn't reach a depth of a workforce that could meet the need for cognitive evaluation. So we also built a self-report symptom inventory that measures cognitive complaints, not cognitive function. It measures cognitive complaints across the same domains that our typical neuropsychological assessment battery does. Here are those materials. Again, totally free. Here in the States, Spanish is our second most populous language. So we have adult and juvenile versions in English and in Spanish. Also happy to work with anyone who's interested in translating those into other languages. and then we could add it to a library that we could share with people and continue to pay the work forward. And if this is helpful, one of the questions we field a lot is, how do I move from a self-report screen of cognitive complaints to a cognitive screening battery to a comprehensive neuropsychological battery? And we laid that out here in this relatively easy to follow algorithm that I'm also happy to share a PDF. And I know you'll get a copy of these slides also. Very last, I just want to say something about the third part of our model, which is education and promoting self-advocacy among stakeholders. We do a lot of training for the person who sustained the injury to talk about, here's the part of your brain that doesn't work as well, and here's what you're going to do about it. And we do the same education for judges and law enforcement officers and behavioral health professionals, all stakeholders in the criminal legal system. And we also have a secret sauce, which is amplifying self-advocacy in the people who have the brain injury history. These are materials that are available for free. These are tip sheets that we use in this conversation. My student clinicians in our traditional model do a cognitive screening and then meet for a feedback session with clients and share with them these tip sheets. There are adult versions, pediatric or youth versions. There are English and Spanish language versions, and there are tip sheets unique for criminal justice professionals, for behavioral health professionals, and for the injured person themselves. And on the pediatric or youth side, there's also a caregiver version. These map onto the domains that people have complaints in. There's also an online version called the OBISS, OBISSS, that my colleagues in the National State Head Injury Administrator group make available, and they'll also do that for free for underserved people. So now I want to just tell a story about a colleague. This is Markel Taylor. Markel was screened here in one of our pilot years. This was about 12 years ago now. And Markel credits the conversation he had with a student clinician with changing his life. And he was impulsive and had sustained a really significant injury at about age 9. And that student talked about his brain injury very candidly, talked about his complaints of depression very candidly, and gave him mindfulness tools to address those two things. And Markel describes it as feeling like he was careening down the highway in a car in the passenger seat and having access to the steering wheel. So Markel realized that a conversation about brain health was a way to open a conversation about more heavily stigmatized areas like history of mental illness, history of trauma for populations where those are especially hard to talk about. This is Markel's community organization. It's called the Rebuild Your Mind Foundation. You should check them out online. It's what psychology looks like if psychology were not at all part of the equation. It's entirely stakeholder-led. It's led by stakeholders in the community. It's led by stakeholders who are still serving sentences in Department of Corrections. Their mission is to destigmatize brain injury history and destigmatize trauma history and mental illness so that people can have the conversations and receive the care that they need. Markel felt so strongly that everyone should have that same conversation and the chance to access behavioral health care and to have those conversations. Markel wrote, and I was excited to support this piece of legislation. This requires all inmates in Department of Corrections in Colorado here in the US to be screened for brain injury, and people who have a brain injury history will be referred into community care coordination. This is the first of its kind in the States. Here we are, Markel and I on the end there, and our Colorado Governor Polis signing that into legislation. And this young woman, Melissa Bickford, who's standing right in front of me in this picture, you can all see our mid-COVID picture. Melissa got in touch with me. She saw a little bit about the news buzz about Markel's legislation, and she got in touch with me and wanted to get involved, wanted her story to be told. Her background was that she had been in several abusive relationships and had been treated in the emergency room for brain injuries on a number of occasions, and no one ever had a conversation with her about brain injury. So I did two things, and Melissa is still a longstanding colleague who I adore, and she's so excited that I can share her story. but 2 outputs for her. This is Melissa's first-person story, The Marshall Project. If you don't follow them, it's a brilliant long-form journalism outlet for criminal justice reform pieces. Melissa wrote this with my journalist colleague. So this is a first-person account of Melissa's experience of having a brain injury history and being involved in the criminal legal system, both as a victim and a perpetrator of crime. And Melissa was mentored by Markel, and this is Melissa's legislation, which requires that victims of violent crime be screened for brain injury. Remember that no one ever had that conversation about brain injury with Melissa or warned her that her brain was more vulnerable or that she might be at risk for poor decision-making, for example. So she feels so strongly. This is her piece of legislation, which is also the first of its kind, to roll into action. And both of these programs are in pilot study now, and I'm excited to get to field questions about them. And without further ado, I pass it now, I think, back to Eddy, and thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gorgens. It's astounding, the work that you've been doing and the legislation. It's just absolutely wonderful. And thank you so much for all the resources that you've shared and the tools. So yeah, we'll look forward to, there's some really nice comments coming in the chat, and we'll get to questions at the latter after all the presentations. So right now, what I'll do is I'll introduce our next speaker. So this is Dr. Flora Matheson. Dr. Flora, I'd like to welcome you and also Madison Ford, who is supporting us with the presentation today. Dr. Matheson is the Unity Health Toronto Chair in Homelessness, Housing and Health. Dr. Matheson is a sociologist leading the Justice and Equity Lab, located at the MAP Center for Urban Health Solutions at St. Michael's Hospital, and is an associate professor at the Alana School of Public Health and the Center for Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies at the University of Toronto. Her research program focuses on gender inequities and other social determinants of health affecting justice-involved individuals. Her most recent research examines community supervision and reentry programs for those with TBI. With a network of partners, she provides education on brain injury to frontline staff. She is developing a new program in Ontario to help justice-involved individuals with brain injury navigate health, justice, and social services in the community. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Matheson. I turn things over to you.
Thanks, Alana. It's like Kim, it is a pleasure and an honor to be here today to speak with the panels. It's quite a feat to get us all together, I think. So it's quite a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to jump right into my talk and start with a visual that shows the complex relationship between the criminal justice system here in Canada and the mental health system, or this is actually in Ontario. And I like to start with this slide because it shows the complex relationship between the criminal justice system and the mental health system and where they intersect. And I like to show this because people with brain injury often find themselves entwined between both of these systems. And these systems are incredibly challenging to navigate. You can see this just by looking at the intersections within and across the two systems. And these are not the only systems that people have to navigate. They may need to access the housing and shelter system, the health system, the social service system, the education system, and the list goes on. And so having one's needs met within these systems is complicated and challenging. And it becomes even more challenging for people who have traumatic brain injury. The prevalence of brain injury is in the criminal justice system ranges anywhere from 30% to 88%. So as Hugh said early on, in reality, the majority of people who are justice involved have a history of traumatic brain injury. And we also know this injury is underdiagnosed medically in the population. And there are several reasons for underdiagnosis and underreporting. People often don't seek care, and there are a variety of reasons why they don't seek care. It's very hard to get a medical assessment, at least here in Canada, to determine a diagnosis of traumatic brain injury. Even when you seek care, there are long wait lists for assessment and treatment. So let me turn now to some of the research we've been doing here in Ontario on traumatic brain injury and complex needs among people who are justice involved. One of our papers focused on men and women 3 years prior to their first federal sentence. And this slide shows the prevalence of social and health needs among pre-incarcerated women 3 years prior to their first federal sentence, compared to a matched general population group. The data is based on federal sample of men and women who are linked to their medical records at ICES. And ICES is an agency that houses the medical records of all Ontario residents with valid health cards. So what you're seeing are diagnoses of these health concerns. So you can see very high rates of mental illness and substance use and injuries relative to the matched sample of women in the general population. So you see 40% of pre-incarceration women have a diagnosis of depression, 47% have a diagnosis of drug use, and these percentages are much higher than in the general population. Now, if I show you the same rates among men, you see that these health concerns are also higher for the pre-incarceration men than the general population. So what can this mean? To me, it means that we are incarcerating people with complex health needs, with considerable complex health needs in our prisons and in our jails, because you'll see that we also have this situation in a provincial sample. And we know in general that these institutions are not originally designed to address these health needs. I've also isolated traumatic brain injury on both sides. Let's look at the women. The rate is about 10%, and it's 11% for the men. So lower than the 88% we saw on the earlier slide, but still much higher than what's diagnosed in the general population at around 3 and 5%. One other statistic you might have noticed on these two slides is the percentage of people living in neighborhoods marked by poverty or material deprivation. And because we matched the general population to the pre-incarceration sample on that particular variable, you'll also notice that the same percentage of the sample in the general population is living in high poverty neighborhoods. Now, let's look at the prevalence of the complex health needs among a provincial sample of men and trans men. So these are men who were released from the Toronto South Detention Centre in Ontario. And again, we see very high rates of complex needs, even higher prevalence for some than we saw in the federal sample. So the prevalence of mental illness here is 61%, substance use is 85%, and assault is 43%. And again, this information was linked to the ICES medical records. So these are medical diagnoses. Here we're able to measure homelessness, and the prevalence is 42%. And over 60% are living in neighborhoods marked by poverty. So even higher than in the federal sample. In the sidebar, we see that 26% had a diagnosis of traumatic brain injury. So 2 times the rate for the federal sample than the federal sample, sorry. So there seems to be higher complex needs among this particular sample in the provincial sample. Now I want to show you what it looks like for their healthcare utilization. This is the pre-incarceration sample, so the federal sample. And we see higher average visits for both men and women relative to their general population comparison group for all 3 types of visits. So emergency departments, psychiatrists, and general practitioners. In the 3 years prior to their first federal sentence, relative to each general population comparison group. So this suggests that they used a variety of avenues to get their needs met. When we explored health service use for the men and trans men in the provincial sample, we found that they had 3 times greater risk of emergency department visits in the 3 months post-release from the Toronto South Detention Centre relative to the general population group. So what we concluded from this is that they were actually using EDs as de facto walk-in clinics, and possibly because in Ontario we have a huge crisis in our primary care access. We're losing many of our family doctors, and many people are not going into family practice at the moment. And it's really difficult for people to get into family practice. So now in the next slide, I want to talk to you about a couple of papers where we focus specifically on traumatic brain injury. In the first paper, we identified a cohort of 1.4 million young adults aged 18 to 28 in 1997, and we wanted to identify their history of traumatic brain injury from diagnostic codes in the ICES medical records and a history of incarceration from the Correctional Services of Canada Offender Management Database, which was linked to the ICES data. So the primary outcome in this paper was risk of first federal incarceration from 1998 to 2011. And our primary finding was that young adults in Ontario, aged 18 to 28, with a history of traumatic brain injury were 2.5 times more likely to be federally incarcerated than young adults without traumatic brain injury. In the lower part of the slide, this was our follow-up study. We used the same linked data, and we looked at a cohort of adults aged 18 and over. And these were adults experiencing their first federal sentence between 1998 and 2011. And we looked at serious in-prison disciplinary charges incurred 2 years post-sentence commencement. And TBI, again, was based on diagnostic codes. And we wanted to understand the association between traumatic brain injury and disciplinary charges. So what did we find? 13% of the sample had a traumatic brain injury. 1/3 of the sample with TBI incurred a serious in-prison disciplinary charge. 40% of the men had a TBI and incurred a serious charge. 30% of the women incurred in-prison disciplinary charge. And those with traumatic brain injury were 14 times greater risk of incurring a serious in-prison disciplinary charge than those without a TBI. So some of the takeaways from these two studies suggest that TBI is a risk factor for incarceration, especially for young adults, and that having a TBI makes it difficult for people to adapt within the prison environment, which isn't equipped to support people who are differently abled. We also know there are few to no interventions and accommodation for brain injury in prison and jail. So just to end out the discussion of prevalence, I want to note a couple of Canadian studies on self-reported brain injury among women that suggest higher prevalence than the data I showed you with medical diagnosis. In a study by Bowman, 90% of a sample of women engaged in sex work and supported by a reentry agency reported a history of brain injury. And in the study by Colantonio, 38% of a prison sample of women reported a history of brain injury. Now, we do have some gaps in knowledge in Canada that I should point out. We have no Canadian data on brain injury among youth in correctional settings that I was able to find. Also, no data on brain injury for Indigenous individuals or Black individuals who come in contact with the justice system. I noted the paper that Hugh spoke about in his presentation, but I wasn't able to find anything around brain injury for Indigenous individuals in the criminal justice system. So we don't have that information. Yet these groups are really over-incarcerated in our jails and prison. And I'll give you just a couple of examples with a focus on women. Indigenous women make up 42% of women in provincial and territorial custody and 50% of women in federal custody. That's too many. It's certainly an overrepresentation of our Indigenous women in our custodial settings. And Black female youth make up 11% of all female youth admissions to provincial custody. So it's a real and a disturbing and continuing issue in our country with the incarceration of Indigenous and Black individuals, and something that we have to continue to work on. Now, I just want to talk briefly about the intervention landscape. I can't talk to all of the agencies that provide brain injury and social and human services in Canada. I know the Ontario landscape best, and not even all of the Ontario landscape, because it's so large. What I can say is that people who intersect with the criminal justice system get support from a broad range of sources, including the ministries that are responsible for their supervision, community agencies that support them during reentry, and from brain injury services, just to name a few. I do want to mention the acquired brain injury navigators. These navigators are unique to Ontario. They connect people with brain injury to health system supports and services. They provide education on brain injury, resource navigation, complex care coordination, and identify system gaps and barriers. And my understanding is they aren't specifically mandated to support people in the justice system, but they are often asked to do this because there aren't a lot of supports for people with justice involvement other than the other agencies I mentioned. And the demand for their services is huge. And with only 13 across the province, you can imagine their demand is huge. Let's move on to the Breaking the Cycle network, which is a 30-member strong network. Together, we co-create interventions for people who are justice involved. We also engage in research, education, advocacy, and evaluation. We are community justice and reentry service agencies, brain injury support organizations, community support groups, people with lived experience, justice system partners, and researchers. We began in 2019. We had our first symposium in 2020, just before COVID hit, and then we all went underground. During this symposium, we discussed some initial ideas on what to create to support reentry for people with brain injury. We re-envisioned those initial ideas and did some research through the pandemic. We did some more thinking about a solution, and we're doing more research today. And I just want to tell you where we are right now, which is we put together a Navigator model, which is aligned with the prison Linkworker in the UK, which Annmarie is going to speak about, and the neuro resource facilitation models in the US and elsewhere, and many other Navigator models in existence. Within this particular model, and I'm just going to talk very briefly about it, some of the work of the Navigator is to help clients get a diagnosis for brain injury. This will enable them to get access to medical care related to the injury, as well as disability and financial supports. It's very difficult in Ontario to get a diagnosis for traumatic brain injury. Often community agencies have to do a historical diagnosis. It's very difficult to get assessment here. The Navigator can also provide justice system support, such as attending appointments with probation and parole officers, helping clients understand their conditions of release, and creating maps and documents for clients to manage the conditions to reduce potential breaches, because breaching is a real challenge for people because it can get them back into the system. The role is designed to be flexible, so the Navigator can be situated, for example, in a community agency that supports reintegration, in a brain injury service agency that supports justice involved clients more generally, or with an agency that has staff situated at a bail or a court, a bail center or a court. So the role can be adapted to fit the need, but there's always a focus on supports for brain injury and in relation to the justice system. And where are we right now? We're seeking funding from a variety of sources to try to get a pilot implemented. So I'll leave you with that, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Flora. That was absolutely fascinating. And I love how all these presentations just seamlessly flow into one another. Absolutely fascinating. And I think I'll be probably watching these videos 2 or 3 times at the end of this session, because there's just so much to process. So I'd like to turn next to our final speakers. We have with us today, also from the UK, where it's quite late, Dr. Annmarie Burns, who is a consultant clinical neuropsychologist with Brainkind UK and the North London Mental Health Partnership NHS Trust. Annmarie has over 25 years of experience in neurorehabilitation. Since joining Brainkind in 2021, she has been instrumental in developing and delivering specialized programs for individuals going through the criminal justice system. She has also studied the prevalence of brain injuries among survivors of domestic violence. Dr. Burns and her colleague, Elizabeth Wills, will discuss the Brain Injury Linkworker service, which provides screening, intervention, and psychoeducation to address cognitive, behavioral, and emotional challenges for individuals with TBI in UK prisons and on probation. This program empowers individuals to manage their brain injuries and has led to notable reductions in incidents and adjudications. So, Annmarie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I hope I am seamless now after that introduction. Okay, great. And hopefully you can see my slides.
We can.
Great. So I'm going to follow on from the great speakers that have gone before me, talking a lot about the prevalence rate and the challenges of living with a brain injury, and talk about our Linkworker service, which is based in the UK. Predominantly, we deliver to prisons and probation services in England and Wales. I'm just going to talk you through how we developed it and how it works. So I'm going to start with a short film, which hopefully you will be able to hear. And this really allows us to hear about the service from the perspective of someone who's used our Linkworker service. So I'm going to let Jade take the floor and tell you a little bit about our service.
The brain is a very delicate organ and can be injured in many different ways.
Blows to the head, stroke, meningitis, of things that changes how you think about gens, how you think, how you work.
My left arm started going numb. Went to ask my mate for a visitor. It's coming out. The pure gobbledygook. Jane, I get out of
Annmarie, the video is a bit choppy for us.
Is it? Okay. In which case, maybe what I'll do is my colleague Liz is on, and maybe she'll put the link in the chat, and then people can watch the video another time.
Or if you want to try restarting it to see if it does work.
I'll try one more time. If it doesn't work, can you just let me know, and we'll
do.
Let's see what happens.
Thank you.
Understand where we sit socially in a variety of contexts.
How can you get other people to understand you don't understand? I'm not sure why you're behaving the way you are, and I'm not sure why you can no. 1 minute extra crying. Sorry.
Okay. It might be a bit much trying to show a video. It is available on YouTube, and it's called Invisible Me. And if you put in Invisible Me, Brainkind, it will come up. And essentially, it's one of the men that we worked with in prison in South Wales, talking about his experience of having a brain injury. And his was a stroke, but even so, he didn't really know what had happened to him. And working with the Linkworker really helped him to understand what his difficulties were and be able to advocate for himself and get the support that he needed. But I will leave you to watch that film. Right, here we go. Okay, so the Brain Injury Linkworker service has been designed to be a service that can be sustainable, it's affordable, and can run as a standalone service within prisons and probation. And this is basically the pathway that everybody who goes through our service follows. So we aim to identify people with brain injury as they come into the prison, and it varies a bit depending on which prison we're in or which probation service we're in, but most will have as part of their screening some questions about brain injury that I'll come on to later, which helps identify that the person should be referred on to the brain injury Linkworker service. We will then complete an assessment with them across not just brain injury, but a whole range of different things. People today have talked a lot about the complexity of the issues that people within the criminal justice system face. And so we aim to look at lots of different aspects of their presentation. We then work with them on what their goals are, what they'd like to work on. We think for those people who might be being released in the near future, we'll spend some time thinking about pre-release support, and then we'll write a comprehensive discharge report. So everybody that leaves our service will take with them a letter that details the difficulties they have and the kind of support that they need. So just thinking about the first part of that pathway, we ask that when people come into prison, that in the UK they'll have a screening, and these two questions are usually within that screening, and if people answer yes to either of those questions, then we ask that they're referred to our brain injury Linkworker. And once they come to the brain injury Linkworker, we will then assess them with the brain injury screening index. Now, I was looking at the OSU brain injury identification method, and it looks very similar. This has been standardised and normed on a UK criminal justice population, but it asks many of the same questions. And again, anyone can do this questionnaire. It's freely available on our website. It's not just for clinicians. Any frontline worker can use it. And it's a very simple way of supporting the person to talk about brain injury. For many of the people that we work with, this is the first time that anyone's really asked them about brain injury. They're not even aware that they've necessarily had one. And the first question is, have you ever had a serious blow to the head? And often they'll say, oh, no, I haven't. And it's only when later we ask them about whether they've ever lost consciousness, they say, oh, yes, that was that time that I was hit with a brick or something else. And actually, a lot of the people that we work with live within the context of such extreme violence that what you and I would consider a serious blow to the head isn't something notable to them. So having this structured questionnaire is really helpful in supporting them to identify that they potentially had a brain injury. And we also are just at the moment, we're just starting to work in a female establishment as well. And we now have a updated version of this screening test to ask some slightly different questions, because we find that with women, because their brain injuries are normally sustained in the context of domestic abuse, it is slightly different, and slightly different questions are helpful. And with women, it's particularly important to ask about whether they've been held in a way they felt they couldn't breathe, and ask about non-fatal strangulation, because, of course, that's another potential mechanism of brain injury in terms of a hypoxic brain injury. That's just the second page of the brain injury screening index. So all of the people that then screen positive for a history of brain injury, we consent them to participate in our service, and we provide them all with a tips and tricks booklet. And this is another resource that's available on our website. And this just takes them through some of the common consequences of a brain injury and some of the things that might help them. We work in the UK in lots of remand prisons, and these are prisons where the turnover is very, very high, and people may be only in the prison for a couple of weeks before they get moved on. So we feel it's really important that if we do identify that someone has got a history indicative of brain injury, that we provide them with something, because we might not see them again. And that leaflet goes through quite a lot of education, and hopefully, even if we don't see them again, we'll support them to advocate for themselves and get the help that they need. For those that are around and are able to engage with us, we'll work with them very collaboratively around what their goals are. Often their goals are quite big. So we'll help them to think about, well, what are the steps needed to work towards that goal? So they might say that they'd like to get a job in the prison, and we'll think, well, okay, well, what are the things that you need to be able to do to secure a job in the prison, and help them walk towards that. And we also recording outcomes, measuring outcomes is really important to us. It's important in terms of the individual and monitoring their progress, but it's also important in terms of us being able to demonstrate that our service is effective. We are commissioned sometimes on quite a short-term basis, so it's really important for us to be able to show that the service is worth the money to our commissioners. On average, people have between 3 to 6 sessions, but that isn't a hard and fast rule. And actually, if people are in prison for a longer time, then we will see them over that period if they still have outstanding goals. And a lot of the things that we will work with them on is education about brain injury. It's often the first time that they've ever thought about brain injury in any depth. It's often the first time that they've really had an opportunity to explore that with someone who understands brain injury. But we also think about practical things, and we'll work with them on what kind of compensatory strategies they might need. So, for example, if someone has a memory problem, we might think about what strategies might work for them. And obviously within prisons in particular, we're very restricted in the UK about what we can use. They often, very few people in prison in the UK have access to digital platforms, to laptops or phones. So often it's very pen and paper based strategies, but we'll work with them in the sessions, we'll practice them, we'll use role play if that's helpful to them, so that they can then take those strategies outside of the sessions and use them within the prison. We also work very closely with staff in the prison, and we do lots of training. So alongside our one-to-one interventions with the people in prison, we'll also do training with prison officers, healthcare staff, education staff. And where appropriate, if people are going to be leaving the prison soon, or if we're working within a probation setting, we'll also liaise with friends and family. And I've already sort of got ahead of myself slightly, but we, as I've said, do lots of interventions with the wider system. What I didn't mention was that we'll also do prison listener training. So this is where someone who's been through our Linkworker service themselves will then train to be a prison listener, and they'll talk to other prisoners about the service, and they'll support them as well as they work through with the Linkworker. So just then thinking about pre-release planning. So we have something called a moving on plan, and we'll sit down with the person and think about, well, what are the potential risks when they go back to the community? What are the sorts of things that they might find difficult? What are the challenges going to be? And we'll sit with them and we'll plan, well, what are the strategies that you learn? What are the things that you can do to try and minimize those risks and overcome them? We'll also help them to establish relationships with the relevant agencies. And housing is often a huge anxiety for the people that we work with. Often people are homeless on leaving prison, and we've already heard today about how being homeless also places you at greater risk of brain injury. So we will link with housing, probation, mental health services, community neuro rehab services. In the UK, often people who have a brain injury but a forensic history will find that they're excluded from services. And we found that if we link in with the community neuro rehab services and say, look, we've been working with this person in the prison service, they really do need your support, they're much more likely to take them on. And we've even had situations where community rehab services have called us to say, actually, one of the people we're working with has gone into custody. Could you please go and see them and assess them? And we'll always try and send the discharge letters or and copies of the moving on plan, if the people we're working with are happy for us to do so, to the relevant agencies so that they have all the information. Systems aren't that joined up in the UK, and so notes on systems in prison aren't going to be available to people in probation necessarily, and certainly not to healthcare outside of the prison setting. So it's really important that that information does get shared. So I just thought it'd be helpful to take you through a case study, since the video didn't work as well. And this is a gentleman that we worked with called Kieran. He was in his 50s when he was referred to our service, and he didn't have or didn't disclose a particular history of childhood trauma, but he did report quite significant difficulties with substance misuse throughout his life. And he reported that he had been assaulted and had experienced a brain injury during that assault. And actually what had happened was he had been assaulted outside a hospital, well, near a hospital, and some nurses were just coming off shift. And so they kind of intervened. And so he had got quite quickly into accident and emergency, and he had actually had a brain scan, which is pretty unusual, and so we did actually have information to tell us that he'd had a bifrontal hemorrhage, and what he had noticed was that he was having difficulty with his cognition, with his personality, that he was much more impulsive, and that he was struggling with his memory. And so what we did initially with him was we started with brain injury education, which he was really responsive to, and we spent some time explaining to him the common consequences of brain injury. And then we started to sort of work with him on thinking about coping strategies and what kind of coping strategies would be helpful for him. And we worked on a number of different things, but we also liaised with the staff in the activities hub to try and find him an appropriate job, because he had previously had a job, I think, in waste management, but it had been quite complicated. There were lots of rules he had to follow, and he was getting very frustrated and quite angry and agitated. And so that had not worked. So move on to the next bit. The other aspect of Kieran's presentation was that he was quite disinhibited at times, that he'd become quite angry and quite agitated. And what we noticed was that with him was that he was quite insightful, that he was able to think about what the triggers were to his agitation and his anger. And Kieran was a mechanic prior to coming into custody, and he stated that when he was becoming agitated, that it was like he was becoming quite excitable, and we thought about, well, what are the things that you could do to try and kind of reduce that agitation, to reduce that stimulation? And he came up with the mantra of dipping the clutch. He said that what he needed to do was that when he was feeling like that, he just needed to dip the clutch. And so that's what we worked on with him, and he would just say that to himself, and it worked really, really well. So the outcome with Kieran was that he did really well on our measures of depression and low mood, which are the PHQ and the GAD. Both of those improved, and I think that that was in the most part because he was able to understand his brain injury a lot better, and he was better able to advocate for himself, and that made a real difference. He also developed this kind of sense of control over his brain, over his behavior, and that really helped too. Using this mantra was really helpful to him. So just going to quickly talk a little bit about our training. So here are some of the quotes, things that have actually been said to me when I've gone to do brain injury training in prisons in the UK. And I always kind of bring these up because I think it's really important that we have a space to talk about these things, because it's only if people voice these concerns or beliefs that we can really start to work on them. And we've developed a training program called Ask, Understand, Adapt, which is available on the Ministry of Justice mandatory training portal. And we're hoping to get it on our website, but for various reasons it's a bit complicated. But essentially, the idea behind this training package is that we encourage people to ask about brain injury. We teach them what are the sorts of questions that you might want to ask. We improve their knowledge about brain injury so they can understand what the person might be struggling with and what they're presenting with. But also we provide some really practical tools around how they can adapt their practice. I'm just going to very briefly take you through some of our research. So we recently conducted a service evaluation at HMPPS Cardiff and Swansea. We assessed and consented 171 men, and they all had a brain injury Linkworker intervention of varying lengths, but on average between 3 to 6 sessions. And what we found was that the majority of people, their anxiety improved significantly. Most of them were moving from the moderate to severe range of anxiety into the minimal to mild ranges. Now, these were significant changes. We found the same with low mood as well, that there was a really positive impact of our intervention on people's low mood, again, with people moving from the moderate to severe range at the beginning of treatment to the mild to moderate, minimal to mild ranges by the end of treatment. And we also are really focused on asking the people themselves about their impression of our intervention. So we ask the men and women that we work with about whether or not they feel that their understanding of brain injury has improved, whether they're able to communicate their difficulties and struggles to others. Do they feel better able to participate in the prison regime? And we also ask them a little bit about their sense of control over their own behaviours and whether they feel they can avoid conflict. And on all of those measures, we find that people report that they have improved, and we can kind of match those findings with our other data that we collect. So, for example, lots of the men state that they feel they improve significantly in terms of their engagement with the prison regime. And actually, that's very much reflected. We see that when we work with people, they move from, in the UK, we have different regimes, and a lot of the men move from the standard regime to the enhanced regime. And the enhanced regime is where people are able to have a job, they get greater visiting rights, they get more money in their canteen. So these are things that really make a difference to their quality of life within the prison. As everybody has said today, there is always complexity. And one of the things that people often say to me is, well, how do you know that the things that these people are presenting with are brain injury symptoms? And yes, the symptoms do overlap with many other issues, such as substance use, mental health issues. And many of the people that we work with will have more than one issue. But what I will always say is that understanding that they have a brain injury is a really important part of that puzzle. And it's only when they understand that they can put some of the things that they're experiencing into context. So really asking about brain injury and validating their experience really goes a long way in supporting these people. And finally, in our wider charity, every month we have a mantra around neuro rehab. And one of my favourites, and one that I think really works within this context, is every interaction is rehab. And this has felt meaningful to lots of the people that we work with, and lots of the staff that we train. Every conversation that we have with someone in custody or someone on probation with a brain injury is an opportunity for neurorehabilitation. If we think about how we communicate, if we take the time to understand the difficulties that people are experiencing, and we support them to advocate for themselves, that's really going to make a huge difference. And that is really the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Let me add my applause to that as well. There you go. Thank you, Annmarie, so much. Absolutely fascinating. I feel so lucky that I've been able to hear all these presentations, because this is that kind of high level information that you would typically get at an academic or a professional conference. So we're very lucky to have all of you here. And we are grateful that you have already started answering the questions in the Q&A window, which has saved some time. So for people who've posed questions there, please feel free to take a look. We'll also send those answers to everybody in the package that we send out. We're going to start things off with a few of our own questions, and then we'll jump in with audience questions. And we're trying to get some links from the panelists to get in the chat window, and we're just working behind the scenes on that. But in the meantime, Alana, I'll turn it to you for one of our first questions.
Thanks so much, Eddy. And some of those links were added into the chat now, so please feel free to look at those resources, everyone. So for our first question, and this is to any of the panelists who want to jump in and respond. How can we shift understanding in institutions and community to thinking about behavior as resulting from brain injury rather than a character defect?
I start? Okay. Well, we're trying to do that. And I really liked what Annmarie said, that every interaction is a rehabilitative situation. In our Short Start, in the UK, we have a trauma-informed way of working with young people in a criminal justice setting. That is very much about every interaction matters, because it's the people who are in front of the person who's going to be able to help things shift. And the Secure Stairs program. But changing the attitudes, it comes from every possible angle in the system, doesn't it? So, I guess the shortest answer to a wicked problem is to say we have to engage with the policymakers, and the policymakers have to be aware of the drivers to adopt a more brain-kind way of working that addresses trauma and adversity from a young age, as it complicates the picture and trajectory of young people. They have to grapple with it and find ways to ensure that they're spending our capacity and resources to try to address these issues earlier on, and then gain the benefit from that. And one set of things that can be done around that is to put into government thinking the way in which, if you integrate more effectively across education, health, social care, justice settings, and so on, you can then reap the benefits of that down the line by reducing the economic and human costs of crime. Murder costs about 2.5 to 3 million. Grievous bodily harm about 350 to 400,000. So the economic costs are huge, but when you look at the human cost, that is, well, it's inhumane that we allow it to continue to happen. So I guess it's trying to make sure that we have to have a hearts and minds approach, but also we have to have an economic argument, otherwise things don't shift. The ways we've been able to shift things a bit in the UK, I've been hearing about the Linkworker project, the screening and all the rest of it, is because we've been able to give evidence to the select committees in parliaments, in our British Parliament, but also in the Scottish Parliament and so on, to get the point across, put the evidence in front of policymakers and build up across-party initiatives so that people understand the importance of it. But you have to keep on with it, because people will drift towards other things. Politicians' windows of doing something is short often, so you have to get strategically involved. So I'm sorry, I was going to say it was short. One thing that is coming up is more work is happening about the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We need to look at all the UN conventions around people with disability. We need to think about UN SDGs, UN Sustainable Development Goals around equality and access to healthcare and so on, particularly for girls and women who would be very much vulnerable to violence, but also being exploited and utilized towards criminal ends down the way. So I think it is really important that hearing the really good work happening in Canada, there's really good work happening in the UK, in New Zealand, in various other places, and in other places in South Africa. We work a lot in Cape Town, for example, as well. But we need to add more towards preventative, earlier interventions, and we need to get a hold of policymakers to create change. I was particularly struck, Kim, by your work, which is lovely, around enabling and supporting people to tell their stories and then creating ways in which they can design things. So it's about and bringing that voice in, which is really important. So I think there's wonderful opportunities to make the case and utilize the legislation that we have access to, but we need to make that happen in the countries that have signed up to UN CRCs. That does not, unfortunately, include the USA, but 187 of the countries.
It's wonderful.
Hugh, I don't know why we're not on board with that, but we sure should be. I'll add one super basic point that is so much less globally informed than your answer. And we've had so much success with training around can't versus won't, or some people call it like skill versus will. And we had one of our pilot years, we invited correctional staff to refer clients they thought would benefit from a brain injury screening. And they're like, unfortunately named hit rate. The hit rate, or the positive identification rate, was 100%. And we found that these are folks who are on the radar of staff and professionals in those settings, and knowing something about it and how to manage them better is actually like a really easy sell. Yeah.
On the point with UNCRC in the US, we have in the US as well, though, you have lots of very good things, and you have the CDC and Julia Krupa and people who are really advocating really well. So, and you have this school exclusion problem in some of your states, which is problematic. But you also have legislation in America that, if you address that legislation around providing access to support for kids with disability and people with disability, it's there in your state and your federal systems.
Right.
So I think America has lots that you are doing and can be doing.
Yeah.
And certainly, and also you've got problem-solving courts. Texas has problem-solving courts, which is great. So that is another in around sentences being more sensitive to the issues. Trying to utilize the opportunity, use that interaction, a court interaction. That's actually, well, what support do you need for this to change? And it'll cost us less in the future. It'll cost us less, and you will be able to be a taxpayer, and you'll be able to bring up your family.
Yeah, love that.
Excellent. I wanted to ask a question related to my research on social isolation and loneliness. We know that those have a profound impact on people's health, and that people involved in the criminal justice system are obviously more likely to be isolated and to feel lonely. Am I to imagine that people with TBI involved in the criminal justice system experience loneliness and isolation even more acutely? And how does that affect? Because we know from the research that when people are really, really isolated and lonely, their social perceptions of others and themselves change. They become quite afraid of people, almost a little paranoid. And so I'm just thinking how that fits. And if you already have a TBI, if you already have that vulnerability, how much worse that must be if you're isolated and lonely as well.
Eddy, this is the absolute other end of the continuum from the question you're asking, but we have a new collaboration with a disability rights group in North Carolina who is doing really interesting work here in the States. We very famously incarcerate more people than anyone in the world. And the kinds of civil rights and human rights abuses in those settings are horrifying, one of which is the use of administrative segregation or solitary confinement. And that group got in touch to look at the intersection of brain injury and other vulnerabilities for populations of folks who are managed in ADSEG or solitary confinement. And I'm curious to see how that pilot study works out. And of course, that's the extreme version of your answer. And I know my colleagues can speak to the kind of interpersonal experience in a way that is a little bit less stark, perhaps.
Kim, that's a very important piece of work. If you look at legislation, there's disability discrimination going on here. People with disability are being discriminated against by having access to support systems and resources to enable them to have behavior change being denied to them. Therefore, it's a form of torture, isn't it, really? We know the suicide rates are very high after brain injuries, 2 to 3 times higher in women and men who've had a brain injury. Suicide, we've published a paper earlier this year, Hope Kent, one of my postdocs, on a prison here in the UK, showing the elevated levels of suicidal activity, actually trying to kill yourself, being very high, particularly within the first few weeks of being inside. I've met with forensic psychologists to look after our women in prisons, and it's a big issue because they are traumatized, they don't know what to do with themselves, and it's a critical period. Of course, we need to think about protection of the public and change of behavior, and we need to be thinking about how can we enable change. But it's vital that we have better systems in place because we are denying people opportunities to change behavior, but also discriminating against people with disability. And the point there about identity is key. We showed in one study, not in prison populations, but in over 500 or 600 people with head injury and TBI, that self-esteem was particularly worse in those who could not share something about their story. But having a narrative with somebody you can trust improved your outcomes every which way around. In another study with young people in our young offender units, as they're called in the UK, and I'm sorry about these terms, the YOIs, we found that belonging to a gang was one of the things that was particularly characteristic of the ones with head injury, but they had no other social groups to belong to. And we know social groups are really important to people, and the ones who are more attached to the gang were the more depressed and anxious because they had no other groups to belong to. They were being utilized by gangs or being exploited. We have exploited, marginalized, and discriminated against populations here. And head injury, TBI is in the midst of it, and therefore something needs to be done.
Yes, and I just noticed in the chat, somebody who's worked in corrections for quite some time mentioned that almost all of the people she's worked with have mentioned loneliness as something that they struggle with quite a lot. Yes. Alana, did you have other questions from our list?
Well, thanks, Eddy. I'm just looking at the time and we're at 11:56. So 11:57, only a couple of minutes left. So I'm wondering if we might be able to end with kind of a broader question that might apply to all of us. And that's what are some of the most important steps to support brain health for people with traumatic brain injury and even all of us today on the call?
I love this. I think it's all the things. Yeah, right. It's like hopefully you've heard so much today about it's even Eddy's question about leveraging social support and using belongingness, and it's every anti-inflammatory intervention you could think of, which is sleep and mindfulness and nutrition, and it's stress management and management of substance misuse, and it is the work of a village. And here's all the villagers here, which I think is the really exciting part for me of being part of this group today.
I mean, Kim, I like your list there. That's great, and it'd be nice to actually have a look at creating a guidance piece around this. These are the kind of things that might be helpful. We know that incarceration is not great for your brain. That cortisol level is not going to be great for your brain and all the rest of it. You know, Robin Green, University of Toronto, has been doing some very nice work on degradation of brain systems over time, and or ways in which to stimulate brain systems post injury. She has some very nice work that could be referred into as well in a Canadian context, I'm saying. So that'd be interesting.
And I'll just say, allowing people to do something meaningful. So much time when you're in prison and custody doing nothing, hours and hours and hours. So, enabling them to do something that feels meaningful to them, so important.
Just being able to distract yourself with activities that you enjoy and that put you in that state of flow can make a dramatic difference in feelings of isolation and loneliness. So, yeah.
And I think laughter is a big thing. Finding laughter is huge, right?
Yes. No, that makes it, one of my favorite antidotes. It's wonderful. Wonderful. So, Alana, actually, before Alana closes, we will share the responses to the questions in the Q&A with everyone. And any additional questions we didn't get into in the chat, we will send them to the panelists, and if they have time, can provide some answers. Alana, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Eddy. And thank you to all of the speakers here today, all of the participants that have joined us from all over the world. It's been a tremendous event. We're so grateful for your generosity, your contributions, your comments, your questions. We're going to be sending out a package as a follow-up with the YouTube video link and resources that have been shared today. And one last thank you to Rita Shandil, Neil Palace, I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Mal Hales.
Okay, thank you. April Dorian and Jean-Paul Loriot of Correctional Service Canada for their support and assistance. We look forward to sharing another webinar with you, so feel free to send us your ideas, and we're always looking for topics. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you so much.
And Dennis, if you have any closing words.
No, just to echo Alana, wow, this was what a panel. Thank you so much to each of our panelists. That was fantastic. I learned a lot. Like Eddy said, I think I'll have to rewatch this just to absorb it and take it in a little more at a more leisurely pace, but that was fantastic. Very, very informative. We're so grateful to our panelists, again, taking time out of your busy schedules. I know all of you have a lot on the go and are coming to us from different time zones and different countries. So we are so grateful that you were willing to spend a bit of time with us here today and our group. It was fantastic. Thank you to Eddy and Alana from our local Vancouver Citizen Advisory Committee. They really were the ones taking the initiative, helping put this together. These types of events don't come together on their own. So Eddy and Alana, thank you so much as well for all your time and effort in helping make today a reality. Thank you.